the panel discussion today, we are going to be discussing whether or not nuclear power is something that should be pursued moving in the future. Energy is a constant struggle and concern for every nation on the planet. There are questions regarding the costs, the type, the environmental impact, and so on. In January 2011, prior to the events that occurred at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, 65 new nuclear power plants were under construction across 15 different countries. The Fukushima disaster, like Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island before it, has caused the world to stop and reassess the following idea. Is nuclear power a viable energy source that should continue to be pursued in the future? So, first thing is, immediately after March 11th, Germany shut down its 7 oldest nuclear power plants and has not restarted them. You know, is this a reasonable reaction to what happened at the Daiichi plant?
Do you want me to start?
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I don't know. I feel like what happened at the Daiichi plant is maybe like the result of a lack of foresight, because like no one expected earthquake and a tsunami at the same time. Like Germany doesn't have those unpredictable elements the way that Japan does, so it does seem a little unreasonable.
I think you would have to know what kind of criteria they based those shutdowns on. Whether they were based on test results, or like why only the oldest 7, like what the difference was between the oldest 7 and the ones newer than that, what that benchmark was that caused them to shut down those specifically.
But right, I mean, this is like, it's too dangerous.
Yep.
Right. I wonder how much of it had to do with like public pressure opposed to like an actual concern. Because I think after the incident in Fukushima, people just kind of
there was a massive backlash.
Well, right, it's way more in like social consciousness.
Right.
Yeah.
So I mean, I can understand them wanting to double check that everything was okay, but it was a little.
It seems
jumpy.
knee-jerk.
Yeah.
Now, specifically in Western world, nuclear power is already fairly well established. And most of the power plants that are under construction and still are under construction are in the eastern part of the world. But for example, though, right now, 3/4 of France's power is nuclear. 6 more European countries have over 40% of their power supplied by nuclear means. The U.S. itself, 20% of our power comes from nuclear sources from 104 different plants. Because of, what do you think about these numbers? Should they go up? Should we look, America look to go more towards nuclear power?
Well, I think the practicality of nuclear power comes very much with coastal water, or with coastlines. America doesn't have a whole lot of inland coasts, so the cost to transport that power is exponentially increased as you get further away from those coasts. But when you talk about coastal countries like Italy in Europe, I think nuclear power is extraordinarily practical. Especially when you consider the number of deaths from sources like coal mining and other forms of power. Like nuclear power seems relatively safe, especially in those cases.
Well, in the U.S., like the majority of like major cities are on the coastlines,
right.
On the west and on the east. So obviously their energy like needs are a lot higher than like the Midwest and the West. So
I guess that brings up a good point, though, is that if it is the nuclear power plants are going to be constructed on the coastlines, then that would, if more plants were constructed, that would mean we need to work on our infrastructure and our support or on our energy network, which could be a double-edged sword because it's expensive and being.
Well, I mean the power brownouts in New York City, even like within the last 10 years, have been terrible.
Yeah.
It's just there's one node that goes down and takes down the entire grid for a major American city.
Yeah, so that's something to consider as well. And so it would bring, even though it's costs now, it would be, I mean, anything that has to do with rebuilding the infrastructure could be a good thing. So it's an initial cost of nuclear power, but the it would bring in more money, hopefully, potentially in the long run.
Mm.
I'm actually surprised at the number of nuclear power plants in the U.S. because I thought it would be a lot higher.
Definitely.
The thing is while we have a few more in construction, I think we have to realize, I guess the number's probably going to stay the same, because as we build new ones, other ones are going to get decommissioned as well. Now, America itself, though, has slowed its, we've kind of put a little bit of brakes on this, specifically with President Obama, after everything about nuclear power. So while we've slowed, and other European countries like Britain and the European Energy Commission are doing, different stress tests, other countries have just not stopped at all, like mostly Eastern European, like Finland, Poland, Turkey, Lithuania, and China. They're just going gung-ho, but then you have Germany and Japan, and they've just halted completely, and all of their money's going into renewable resources. What do you think the split should be for America?
I think it would have to be on it would take a lot of research to determine where that split should be. The financial viability of renewable resources. And I mean, there's a lot of cost associated with disposal of nuclear waste. And I don't think we've really got a solid answer for that yet.
So there are several different pros and cons to nuclear power, like big ones, big questions for nuclear power is always going to be, as much as everybody's like, oh, human life, it's cost is what it comes down to. Cost and the future impact on the world and the country, because it hasn't really been around long enough to know what the impact is. And then pros is that it's reliable as well. But some things to think about, for example, Dr. Frank von Hippel, he's the former Assistant Director of National Security at the White House, and he's currently Professor of Internal Affairs at Princeton University, says that, stress testing plants, nuclear power plants, is not a science, but there are set standards and analytical techniques, fault tree analysis, but we can't predict everything, and this was obviously evidenced by the Daiichi disaster. Should this be enough reason just that we can't plan for everything to stop?
Well, there's
No.
an inherent risk in everything.
Everything.
Yeah, I mean,
Everything.
should we
Picking
not,
up a box, you don't know what's in the box.
not live on
100%,
coastal cities because
Right.
of typhoons?
Yeah.
No one should live in Japan based
Like,
on the.
Obviously, there's a risk, but and when nuclear power goes wrong, it goes wrong in a big way. It's horrible.
It goes wrong in a very publicly
Right.
Yeah.
understandable.
But I just there have only really been 3 big ones: Daiichi, Chernobyl, and then.
And of those, only
Yeah.
Chernobyl was the one that led to immediate
just
deaths.
Right.
horrible.
Like direct deaths.
But on the flip side, though, is that against nuclear power is that we don't know the long-term effects, because it was 1986, Chernobyl happened, and we're still seeing things that are going wrong, and how can we compare, because the Ukraine...
But we do have the examples of radiation exposure from the nuclear bombs.
Weapons.
Yeah.
And that's,
Hiroshima and
that
Nagasaki.
is something that I find a little more audacious, is that nuclear proliferation in terms of weapons.
Yeah.
It's never been off the table for the States, but
No.
the idea of using it in a very beneficial way, in a way
In a
that
very controlled sense.
is something that has a lot of public outcry, and it makes very little sense.
I guess that's another reason, though, against nuclear power, though, is that we are refining this, the fuel sources, uranium, and everything that could be easily converted to weapons usage. I mean, that's part of the
That's the
big
big issue
reason
with Iran.
with
Yeah.
Iran,
Things like that.
is that
We
You
used
don't know
to
what they're
execute
doing.
criminals with electricity.
Yeah,
That's true.
that's true.
We
And
do
we
barbaric.
don't outlaw rope, even though we used to execute people with that
we
as
do
well.
barbaric things with
Everything.
everything that we have, and that is really unfortunate, and it is troublesome to think about Iran,
Yeah,
North
yeah.
Korea, But
it's a very powerful fuel source.
right, that's the thing. Like with a country like China,
Yeah,
where
exactly.
like the population is ridiculous and cities are getting bigger and bigger, it makes a lot of sense for them
Right.
to have
It's like
relatively cheap.
we took solar power
Sustainable.
and magnified it and gave Iran a big magnifying glass.
Well, I mean,
It'd
up
all be
until now,
nice.
yeah, China's just been using like coal energy, and I think
The people have suffered
it's
horribly.
killed more people than like any other country in the
Yeah.
world, and so I can understand them seeing
Yes.
it as some sort of, you know, like saving grace, like
Maybe-
this will solve all the problems.
Maybe it is a short-term solution, but I think like based on the information we have,
There's definitely geopolitical
Yeah.
implications.
It is worrisome because, you know, China may choose to build all of these new plants, and then if something does go wrong in China, which obviously we would have no idea, you know,
If it
if
happens.
it happened or
Obviously,
not.
but potentially.
And then, you know, we would eventually know when the fallout started hitting
Blowback.
nearby countries.
So that's a question as well. And how do we? Should regulation be on a country by country basis? And while there is international nuclear regulations, they're
Yeah.
really
Well, I
not
think
well
Chernobyl
defined.
proved that regulation
Yeah.
should be on an international basis.
Yeah.
Especially in the small European countries, like
Well,
they affect
if
each other.
If you're going to
So close.
have regulation in those countries, you have to have it in all countries.
I guess another thing is nuclear power is that statistically, it is one of, if not one of the safest energy sources. I mean, I've never heard though of windmills going off and on a murder rampage. You're just calling.
They fall off.
Yeah, they just fall off. The biggest thing I hear about, windmills is, they're an eyesore
yeah.
when they want to build them.
Birds. And
Well, like at Western, when we put up that turbine, like it was a big deal. It was
Oh,
one
yeah.
turbine.
But the thing is I guess when we look at our renewable energy sources, is that because they're so new, they have the same arguments against them as nuclear powers, that they're just as
Right.
expensive.
Yeah.
And they're not at the 24/7 reliability. But something that might address cost issues, instead of building new plants or safety, would be retrofitting older plants. For example, like France and other European countries retrofitted their older reactors to help against pressure by basically putting in a pressure release that allows this, keep trapping the radiation inside, which was the issue with Daiichi and 3 Mile Island, which is not something expensive. But when it was proposed to the U.S. in 1977, it was denied, so that might be something that's worth looking into as well.
And I've heard too of a certain species of fungi or certain species of fungi, multiple species that will eat radiation. So
Right.
there are power plants now that are coating the outside of their cooling towers in them in case of accidental
Uh-huh.
leak.
See, so I think the big thing is that
There's a lot of research to do.
there's a lot of research to do, and so while there's pros and cons for it, if it's something that we are going to pursue, we have to put more time and effort into it.
I mean, I don't know, I always kind of have a belief in like the ultimate progress of mankind, and like, things will get better. I don't foresee like a dystopic future for mankind. So, I mean, I think pursuing all kinds of like alternative energy sources will eventually come to fruition, but until then.
Until then, it's just trial and error, unfortunately. And
It's economical and
I
political.
was gonna say, I don't
viability.
like that it's a
Yeah.
political question though.
Yeah.
Instead of, like,
The political question is whether, like, as soon as there's a human life lost, it becomes a political question.
But like
And that's a good
in the States, like where there are so many like lobbyists and executives and people in positions of power who have their fingers in a lot of pies when it comes to like petroleum and
Right.
coal and things like that. They're like some of the most outspoken people against
It's very
ventures into new sources of power. So it's hard to take everything that's said at face value, and I think that's kind of disappointing.
Yeah.
So hopefully everyone does their homework. But
Okay, well, thank you for taking your time to discuss whether pros and cons for nuclear power in the future. So, thank you, and good night.